Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a close look at John Quincy Adams, sixth President of the United States.
That's right.
Born 1767, died 1848. His life really spanned a key period in American history.
Absolutely. And his career was just incredibly varied. I mean, diplomat, senator, secretary of state.
President, of course. And then unusually back to Congress after being president.
Exactly. So we've gathered quite a bit on Adams, and our goal here, for this deep dive isn't just a basic biography.
Right.
We really want to dig into some key moments, maybe some lesser-known aspects of his very long public service. Explore what they really meant.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Early life. Son of John and Abigail Adams, obviously. Born right into the thick of it.
You could say that. And his education was quite something, not just local. I mean, he was studying abroad. Paris, Amsterdam.
Leyden, The Hague, too, right? That's a very international perspective for a young American at that time.
It really is. And you have to think how that immersion in Europe, the languages, the politics must have shaped him.
Gave him an edge later, probably, in diplomacy.
Definitely. Understanding those nuances firsthand. Plus, back home, he graduates Harvard in 1787, gets his master's there, too.
And Adams' house at Harvard is named for him and his father.
Correct. Then he becomes a lawyer, but interestingly, not through law school.
Yeah, he apprenticed. Like Hamilton Lincoln, he worked with Theophilus Parsons.
That's the one. Parsons later became Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, so a pretty serious apprenticeship.
It shows that apprenticeship path was really respected then. Very hands-on.
It was the standard way for many. Practical learning, direct mentorship. Different from the university system that came later.
Okay, so moving into his diplomatic career, this seems like a huge part of his story. Started in 1794.
Yes. Ambassador to the Netherlands first, then Prussia, Russia, Great Britain. Quite the tour of duty.
That's a lot of high-level exposure to different powers.
Immensely valuable experience. It really informed his understanding of global politics. But his time as Secretary of State under Monroe, that's arguably where he made his biggest diplomatic mark.
You mean with the Monroe Doctrine?
Precisely. He was the main architect behind it.
Right. The doctrine that basically told European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, no more colonization, no interference.
And declaring any attempt as a threat to the U.S.
Which, when you think about it, was a pretty bold statement for a relatively young nation back then.
It really was. It shows, I think, his strategic thinking. Even without overwhelming military might at that point, he articulated this long-term vision for American security and influence in the hemisphere. He saw the danger of continued European meddling.
Now, before all that, his early political steps in Massachusetts were a bit up and down.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
Elected to the Massachusetts Senate in 1802.
Then lost a U.S. House race that same year.
Correct. But then, shortly after, the state legislature appointed him to the U.S. Senate.
Right, before the direct election of senators. The state legislatures had that power.
Exactly. Shows the different paths to power back then. He served 5 years in the Senate, then went back to diplomacy for a while. He was quite adaptable.
But his return to politics after the presidency is what really stands out. Elected to the House in 1830. That's just unique.
The only former president to ever do that. And he wasn't just warming a seat either.
No, he was active. Championing the Smithsonian Institution, for instance. That's a huge legacy.
It really is. Shows his belief in knowledge, science, and he even pushed for astronomical observatories. Some call him a father of space exploration for that early vision.
Wow. That's forward thinking for the era.
It demonstrates his continued commitment to public service, to building the nation's intellectual capacity, even after holding the top job.
And maybe most importantly, in that House period, he became a real advocate for abolition, the first member to really push it hard.
Yes, and it's interesting. Sources suggest his age and status as a former president gave him a kind of shield.
Protection from the threats other anti-slavery figures faced.
Exactly, which he apparently enjoyed. Maybe relished being able to speak truth to power on that issue without the same level of personal risk others endured.
It gave him a platform, a unique kind of authority.
Definitely. It let him be a powerful moral voice when it was incredibly dangerous to be one. Solidified his later legacy.
Okay, let's talk about that 1824 election. It sounds like a real political tangle.
Oh, it was. A four-way race, no electoral college majority.
So it goes to the House of Representatives.
Right. And Adams wins there, but then the controversy.
The corrupt bargain accusation. Because he names Henry Clay, another candidate, as his Secretary of State.
Exactly. Jackson's supporters, especially, cried foul, claimed a deal was struck. Clay supports Adams in the House vote. Adams makes Clay Secretary of State.
Sounds like modern political mudslinging almost. Did a deal actually happen?
Well, historians still debate the specifics of a definite quid pro quo, but the perception of a bargain was incredibly damaging. It hung over his entire presidency.
And that presidency, 1825 to 1829, seems like it was tough going from the start.
Very much so. His own vice president, John C. Calhoun, actively worked against him.
Wait, his own VP? How does that even work?
Well, Calhoun ended up aligning with the Jacksonian opposition. He used his position apparently to fill Senate posts with anti-Adams people, voted against Adams's policies. It highlights the intense political rivalries back then.
Made it hard to get anything done, I imagine. Like his plans for internal improvements, roads, canals.
Yeah, he faced huge resistance to that ambitious program. There was a big debate about the federal government's role in funding infrastructure.
States' rights versus federal power. That old chestnut.
Exactly. Many felt it was federal overreach, that states should handle those projects. So Adams's national vision hit a wall.
And then the 1828 election against Jackson rolls around. Sounds like it got nasty.
Brutal is probably the word. Really personal attacks on both sides. Adams was painted as an elitist.
And false rumors spread.
Oh, yes. Vicious stuff. And Jackson faced horrible attacks, too, particularly against his wife, Rachel. It was a low point, showing how ugly campaigns could get even then. Jackson won decisively.
But Adams doesn't just fade away after that loss. He goes back to the House in 1830.
Which is just remarkable resilience, really. And he becomes this powerful voice against slavery, against the slaveocracy, as he called it.
He really leaned into that fight, didn't he? Challenging the gag rule in Congress.
Absolutely. That rule was designed to literally silence debate on slavery.
Yeah.
To stop anti-slavery petitions from even being read.
So he fought against that procedure.
Tirelessly. He used parliamentary tactics, his reputation, everything he could to keep the issue front and center, despite the efforts to bury it. It was crucial work.
And then the Amistad case. U.S. v. the Amistad, 1841. This is amazing. A former president arguing in court.
Before the Supreme Court, no less. He was in his 70s, arguing for the freedom of illegally captured Africans who had seized the ship.
And he won.
He won. It was a landmark victory, a powerful statement about justice and human rights, and it showcased his legal skills and moral conviction, even late in life.
What an incredible career arc. But it did eventually end. He had a stroke.
Yes, on the floor of the House, actually, at age 78. He recovered partially, returned to work amazingly.
Still served.
Still serving. But then, during a debate on the Mexican-American War in February 1848, he collapsed again.
And died shortly after.
2 days later. Died practically in the halls of Congress. A symbolic end, really, to a life utterly devoted to public service.
Now, we should touch on the nuance regarding slavery. He became this fierce abolitionist later on.
Absolutely. Unwavering in his later years.
But earlier, during his time as Secretary of State, President, Washington, D.C. itself was a center for the slave trade, right?
It was, and they lived, relatively close to the city jail in a slave pen. It was part of the landscape. And socially, they interacted with prominent slave-owning families. That was the reality of D.C. society then.
It highlights the complexity of the time, even for someone evolving on the issue.
Definitely. You could hold anti-slavery views or be developing them, but still operate within a system deeply entangled with slavery. Daily life, social connections. It was unavoidable.
And there's a specific instance while they were in the White House of two enslaved people living with them, Halsey and Rachel Clark.
That's right. They were legally the property of Louisa Catherine Adams's niece and nephew, but they lived and worked in the White House.
Which, from our perspective today, seems complicated, given his later abolitionism.
It is complicated. It perhaps offered a convenience regarding household labor, but it sits uneasily alongside his later, very vocal condemnation of the entire institution. It shows the messy reality and compromises people made, even those who eventually took a strong moral stand. It reminds us that history isn't always clean lines.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, John Quincy Adams. Clearly a towering figure, diplomat, president, congressman.
His role in the Monroe Doctrine, his post-presidency fight against slavery, the Amistad victory, huge moments.
Significant contributions across so many different roles.
But also important to remember the complexities, especially around slavery. His journey on that issue contrasted with the realities of his time and even his own household.
Definitely. So a final thought maybe for you listening. Thinking about Adams' incredibly long and varied career, both internationally and domestically,
Yeah.
how did all that experience shape him?
Right. And what can his life, with all its triumphs and controversies, teach us about leadership, especially leading a young, rapidly changing nation facing profound moral and political challenges?
Something to chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.